They went looking for the dead, and what they found was so much worse. When archaeologists first broke into the oldest temple on Earth, they expected graves. A cemetery, perhaps, the way any sacred place tends to gather its dead. Instead, they found almost no proper burials at all. Not whole bodies laid to rest with care, not bones arranged in any order that made sense. What they pulled from the rubble that filled those ancient rings was something else entirely. Pieces. Close to 700 fragments of human bone scattered through the fill like so much debris, and more than half of them came from skulls. So if the people who built this place were not burying their dead here, then what exactly were they doing with them? The answer was not waiting in a tomb. It had been carved, very deliberately, into the bone itself. To understand why those bones are so disturbing, you first have to understand the place they came from, and just how thoroughly it has already broken the rules. The story begins in 1995 in the rolling hills of southeastern Turkey, a short drive northeast of the city of Şanlıurfa. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt was walking ground that other researchers had already dismissed. Decades earlier, a survey team had passed over this same hill, seen the broken slabs of limestone poking through the soil, and decided it was nothing more than an abandoned medieval cemetery. Schmidt looked at the same stones and saw something nobody else had dared to imagine. He saw the oldest monument on the planet. What he uncovered over the following years still does not feel possible. Massive pillars carved in the shape of a letter T, some of them rising more than 5 meters from the earth, the largest weighing as much as 10 tons apiece. They stood in great circular rings, their surfaces crawling with carved animals, and they had been raised roughly 11,500 years ago. Sit with that number for a moment. This place was already ancient when the first stone of the pyramids was laid. It predates Stonehenge by some 6,000 years. It is older than writing, older than the wheel, older than metal of any kind. And here is the detail that turned the entire field upside down. The people who built it were not farmers. They had no agriculture, no domesticated animals, no villages, no pottery. They were hunter-gatherers, the very people the textbooks insisted were incapable of anything like this. For a century, the story of civilization had run in one fixed order. First, humans learned to farm, then they settled into towns. Then, once they had surplus and leisure and crowded populations, they finally built temples and monuments to organize it all. Göbekli Tepe arrives and runs that sequence backwards. The monument came first. The grand shared structure came before the farm, before the town, before everything that was supposed to make it possible. That single fact was so startling that it swallowed all the others. The world fixed on one tidy label and held on to it for nearly 2 decades. The world's first temple. It was a satisfying phrase, and it shaped every season of excavation that followed. Schmidt and his teams worked carefully, methodically, exposing one enclosure at a time, mapping each pillar, measuring each ring, cataloging every carved fox and vulture and scorpion. It was patient, disciplined archaeology. But it was also narrow. The focus stayed locked inside each individual circle on the stones themselves and the creatures carved upon them. And while everyone admired the pillars, a quieter problem was sitting in plain sight, refusing to go away. If this was a temple, where was everything a temple should have around it? There were no hearths for cooking, no houses, no clear living quarters, no sign of anyone actually dwelling here. And most troubling of all, for a place so obsessed with ritual and the sacred, there were no graves. Not one proper burial. A monument built on an almost unimaginable scale, by people who left behind no trace of their homes and no trace of their dead. So everyone kept studying the stones. They measured the pillars, traced the carvings, argued about the architecture. Almost nobody stopped to ask the far stranger question. Not what these people built, but what they did with their dead. Before we follow the bones, there is something else hidden in this place that needs to come to light first, because it changes who we think these people actually were. For years, the assumption sat quietly underneath everything. These were hunter-gatherers, after all. Whatever they had managed to build, they must have built it the way such people were imagined to do everything. Roughly, instinctively, one ring thrown up here, another added there, a scatter of circles accumulating on a hillside over generations, with no real plan behind any of it. Impressive, yes, but improvised. A monument raised by feel rather than by design. That assumption held until someone decided to stop looking at the enclosures one at a time and started looking at all of them together. The work was done by two researchers at Tel Aviv University, Gil Hakle and Avi Gopher, and they published their findings in the year 2020 in the Cambridge Archaeological Journal. Their method is worth pausing on because it is the difference between an impression and a measurement. It is called architectural formal analysis, and it is the same kind of technique used to reverse engineer the hidden rules behind any built structure. The first thing they had to do was find the true center of each enclosure, which is harder than it sounds, because the rings are irregular and rough-edged. So they located the precise midpoint between the two great central pillars that stand at the heart of each one, a single fixed point for each circle. Then they looked at where those points fell, and what emerged was something no eye on the ground could ever have seen. The center points of the three oldest and largest enclosures, the ones labeled B, C, and D, did not sit at random across the hill. They formed the three corners of an almost perfect equilateral triangle. Each side measured close to 19 meters, and the whole figure was off from a flawless triangle by less than 30 centimeters, a distortion of barely more than 1% across a structure spanning the width of the site. Now understand what that actually requires. You cannot lay out a precise equilateral triangle of that size by instinct, by eye, in the moment of building. You have to plan it first. You have to decide, before a single 10-ton pillar is dragged into place, exactly where all three centers will sit and how they will relate to one another. The researchers suggested the builders may have sketched the design on the ground beforehand, using something as simple as reeds cut to equal lengths to mark out the geometry. A blueprint, in other words, drawn thousands of years before the invention of writing, by people who supposedly had no way to record or transmit such a thing. And this means the three enclosures were not separate projects raised by separate generations. They were conceived together as a single unified design from the very beginning. One mind, or one tradition of minds, holding the whole plan in view at once. The hunter-gatherers had a master plan. They worked from a code, a set of rules that governed where each monument would rise and how it would speak to the others. And the moment you accept that, the central question of this place quietly transforms. It is no longer enough to ask what Göbekli Tepe was. You have to ask what the code was for, and what these meticulous, organized forward planning people were so determined to arrange. That question leads straight back down into the fill and into the bones. So return to the bones, because this is where the place stops being a wonder and starts being something that unsettles you. Remember the strangeness from the beginning. No proper graves, no skeletons laid to rest, yet close to 700 fragments of human bone pulled from the fill, and more than half of them from skulls. For a long time, that was simply a curiosity, a loose end nobody could tie off. Then, in the year 2017, three researchers from the German Archaeological Institute, Julia Gresky, Julian Helm, and Lee Clare, published a study in the journal Science Advances that gave the loose end a meaning, and it was not a comfortable one. They had been examining the skull fragments under the microscope, and on three of them, they found something that had never been documented anywhere on Earth before. Carved into the bone, running along the top of each skull, were deep, deliberate grooves. Not scratches, not the marks of weather or animals or time. Long, intentional lines cut into the cranium. And on one of the three, in addition to the carving, a hole had been drilled clean through the bone. The microscope settled any doubt about how the marks were made. The grooves carried the unmistakable signature of a flint tool worked across the surface again and again, and the timing told its own grim story. The cut marks had sharp, clean edges, the kind you only get when bone is still fresh and slightly elastic, which means the carving was done soon after death. Before that, the heads had been scalped and the flesh stripped away. Someone took a freshly dead human head, cleaned it down to the bone, and then carefully carved into it. Now ask the obvious question: why? Why carve a groove along the top of a skull, and why drill a hole through it? The researchers offered an answer that makes the hair stand up. A cord threaded through that drilled hole would let the skull hang, and the carved groove would hold that cord in place, keeping the lower jaw from dropping away so the head stayed whole as it hung. In other words, these were not skulls that had been buried or hidden. They were skulls that had been prepared very deliberately to be displayed, strung up, put on show. And once you see that, the carvings on the pillars stop looking like decoration. Across the site, there are images of headless human figures and images of heads being carried, held, offered up. The stones had been telling this story all along. We simply did not know how to read them until the bones spoke first. In fairness, the science here is careful, and that caution is exactly why it deserves your trust. Only 3 of the skulls carry these particular marks. The sample is small, and the researchers did not claim to have solved it. They named it for what it appeared to be, a previously unknown variation of what anthropologists call a skull cult, and they were honest that they could not say whose heads these were. Venerated ancestors kept close and honored in death, or the severed heads of enemies displayed as trophies and warning. The bone cannot tell us which. But the marks are real, and human hands made them with intent, so sit with where that leaves us. The oldest monument human beings ever built together may also hold the oldest evidence we have of what people did to the human head after death. Not buried, carved, drilled, and hung up for everyone to see. Once you have seen what was done to those skulls, you cannot look at the carvings the same way again. For decades, the animals on the pillars were treated as the friendly face of the site. Foxes, vultures, scorpions, snakes, wild boar, a whole stone menagerie wrapped around the great T-shaped stones. They were beautiful, strange, endlessly photographed, and they were quietly filed away as decoration. Ornament. The artistic flourish of a people expressing themselves on the only canvas they had. But decoration is the one thing they almost certainly are not. Look at which animal appears again and again, and the comfort drains out of the imagery. The vulture. It returns across the site, carved with unmistakable care, and the vulture is not a neutral creature in this part of the ancient world. Across the wider Neolithic Near East, the vulture is bound up with death, and specifically with a practice known as excarnation, the deliberate exposure of the dead so that the birds strip the flesh from the bone. The vulture is the creature that takes the body apart, the creature that turns a corpse into clean bone. The very thing, you will notice, that had been done to those 3 carved skulls before a flint blade ever touched them. And then there is the carving that nobody can unsee once they know to look for it. On one of the great pillars, known in the records as Pillar 4-3, a vulture is shown with its wing extended, and beneath it lies a human figure with its head removed, a headless body, and the bird of the dead hovering over it. We cannot say with certainty what that scene meant to the people who carved it. It would be dishonest to pretend otherwise, but set it beside the skulls cut down to the bone, the heads scalped and carved and hung, and the headless figures repeated elsewhere across the stones, and the imagery stops feeling like art about the world. It begins to feel like a record, a statement of belief about death itself, about what becomes of the body and what becomes of the head. There is a second pattern here too, and it points the same way. The placement of the carvings is not arbitrary. Certain creatures recur in certain positions, certain combinations repeat from enclosure to enclosure, which tells us this was a shared visual language, not the doodling of individuals. A code understood by everyone who gathered here. Some researchers suspect the motifs may have marked time, the turning of the seasons, the moment to assemble, the rhythm of whatever rituals bound these people together. We should be careful with that idea because it remains interpretation rather than proven fact. But the underlying point is hard to escape. These carvings were doing work. They carried meaning, and they were arranged according to rules. So consider what we now have standing in front of us. A people who could plan a precise geometric monument before they could write. A people who took the heads of their dead, cleaned them, carved them, and displayed them. And a people who covered the stones of their greatest creation with the imagery of death and the birds that consume it, arranged in a deliberate and repeating code. This was not a simple society stumbling into greatness. This was a sophisticated world with a complex, coordinated grip on life and death, which only sharpens the question that has been building this whole time. Who organized all of this? Who held the plan, summoned the labor, and enforced the code? And what, in the end, did they do with the place when they were finished with it? The strangest thing these people did was not how they built the place, it was how they ended it. Göbekli Tepe was not destroyed by invaders, it did not burn, and it was not toppled in war. For a long time, the leading explanation was stranger than any of those. The people who built it appear to have buried it, deliberately. They took their own monument, the greatest thing they had ever made, and they filled it in, packing the enclosures with limestone rubble, with flint, with broken animal bone, and with those very fragments of human skull, until the towering pillars vanished beneath the earth. And the scale of that act is almost impossible to take in. To entomb a single one of these enclosures, the rubble that had to be gathered and carried and packed into place ran to well over 1,000 tons. That is not the work of a family or a clan. That is hundreds of people laboring in concert, hauling stone for an enormous and entirely deliberate effort, not to build something, but to bury it. Think about what that requires. A society with no farming to feed a workforce, no cities to house one, no writing to organize one, still managed to summon mass-coordinated labor on a monumental scale. They were not bound together by crops or kings or property. They were bound by something else entirely. By shared belief, by collective memory, by a vision powerful enough to move mountains of stone for it. Now, in the interest of honesty, this is a point where the experts genuinely disagree, and you deserve to know that. The deliberate burial has been the dominant story for years, but more recent researchers have pushed back hard. They argue that much of the fill did not arrive by human hands at all, but washed in naturally over time, sediment and debris sliding down from the higher ground around the enclosures, gradually swallowing them. The truth may sit somewhere between the two. But here is what matters, whichever way it fell. The result was the same. The monuments disappeared beneath the soil, and that covering, deliberate or natural, is precisely what preserved them. Sealed away from weather and erosion and human hands, the carvings survived almost untouched for 11,000 years, waiting for Klaus Schmidt to walk that hill. And here's the detail that should banish any lingering thought that this was a one-off, a single strange shrine raised by an isolated band. Göbekli Tepe is not alone. Roughly 35 kilometers away stands another site, Karahan Tepe, with its own T-shaped pillars, its own carved figures, its own unmistakable kinship to the first. And these two are only the beginning. They belong to a whole constellation of related sites scattered across the region, around a dozen of them now, known collectively as the Stone Hills, in Turkish, Tas Tepeler. The same architecture, the same symbols, the same haunting preoccupation with the human form and the human head, repeated from hill to hill across the landscape. So this was never one peculiar temple on one lonely rise. It was a culture, a connected world of people who shared a language of stone and symbol and death, who planned in geometry, who carved their dead, and who in the end sealed their greatest works beneath the ground. Which leaves the hardest question of all, the one that has been waiting since the first skull came out of the fill. If all of this was here in plain sight for so long, how did we manage to get the story so completely wrong? The answer to how we got it so wrong is simpler and stranger than you might expect. We did not miss the evidence because it was hidden. We missed it because we walked onto that hill already certain of what we were looking for. When archaeologists go searching for the beginnings of civilization, they have a fixed picture in mind of what those beginnings should look like. They look for a settlement. Houses, hearths, storage pits, the rubbish heaps of daily life, and somewhere on the edge of it all, a proper cemetery with its dead laid out in orderly graves. That is the signature of an early society, the one the textbooks taught everyone to recognize. So when the first researchers came to Göbekli Tepe and found none of those things, they did not conclude that something extraordinary was happening. They concluded that almost nothing was. No houses, no graves, no farms. So they reached for the one label that seemed to fit, a temple, and they stopped looking. But the people who built this place were never trying to leave behind the things we came searching for. They were doing something we had no template for at all. They were gathering in enormous numbers to raise monuments and to perform rites around the dead, and then dispersing again. The absence of houses was not a gap in the record. It was the record. The absence of normal graves was not a mystery to be explained away. It was the single most important clue on the entire site, and for years it was treated as a footnote. We went hunting for a village and overlooked the fact that we were standing in something far rarer and far darker. And there is a second reason the truth stayed buried, which is that the tools to read it simply did not exist for most of the site's modern life. Carving the species of an animal from the cells of ancient wood, dating a layer of charcoal to within a few centuries, reading the microscopic signature of a flint blade across the surface of a skull and knowing it was cut while the bone was still fresh, none of this was possible in the early decades of digging here. The skulls were in the ground the whole time. What was missing was the science to make them speak. When that science finally arrived, the bones gave up a story no one had thought to ask them for. So gather everything this hill has surrendered and hold it together at once. A monument older than farming, older than writing, older than the wheel, raised by people who were supposed to be incapable of it. A hidden geometric blueprint, planned before anyone could write it down. Close to 700 fragments of human bone, and almost no proper graves. 3 skulls, scalped, carved, and one drilled through to hang. Vultures circling headless men across the stones. And a whole network of these places, sealed beneath the earth and forgotten. No single piece proves the whole. But laid side by side, they describe something the comfortable story never allowed for. This was never simply the world's first temple. It was, from the very beginning, a place built around the dead. And the questions that remain only cut deeper. Whose heads were those, ancestors honored or enemies displayed as warning? Who decided they should hang here, and who was meant to look upon them? And if the very first thing human beings chose to build together was a house for the severed head, then what does that tell us about what we have always been? They went looking for the dawn of civilization, and they found a house for the dead. That is the quiet shock at the center of Göbekli Tepe, and it has only just begun to settle in. We were promised a temple, a charming first step on the long road to towns and farms and writing. What the bones revealed instead was a people who planned in secret geometry, who carved and drilled the skulls of their dead, and who raised the oldest monument on earth not around the living, but around the departed. The wood of this story is bone, and bone does not lie. It was there the whole time, waiting beneath the soil for us to learn how to listen. And as the science sharpens and the next hill is opened, one certainty grows heavier with every season. We have not solved Göbekli Tepe. We have only just started to understand how little we understood.